I'm Melodie, and today we have Miss Jance, and she taught at Pueblo in 1966. Are you ready to begin?
1966 to 68, and I am very honored to be an honorary alum.
We're really glad that you're here to join us today. Let's start off with, what were your students like when you taught at Pueblo?
Well, I was a brand new teacher, so my students were very scary. The first year, they tossed me in with seniors who were just a couple of years younger than I was. And I have to say that those kids pretty much ate me alive. And so the second year, I moved to the afternoon session where the freshmen and sophomores were. I thought I would be better off with younger kids. And so at Christmas time that second year, I went back to Bisbee, and I was visiting with the woman who was my homeroom teacher and my journalism teacher and my newspaper advisor, Rachel Riggins. And she said, well, Judy, how's it going? And I said, well, it's okay, except I have one kid who is driving me nuts. She said, really, what's his name? I said, his name is Fernando Camacho. And she said, what's he do? I said, well, when the bell rings, he comes sauntering in, and he's always at the back of the room, sharpening his pencil. And, you know, he's always doing stuff, and he's not paying any attention to me, and I'm going to flunk him. And Mrs. Reagan said, Judy, if you flunk Fernando as a student, then you are flunking as a teacher. Here's what you need to do. You need to go back to school. You need to make an appointment with Fernando, and don't meet him in the office or your room, meet him out in the parking lot. She said, if he's sitting in your class 4 days a week, not paying any attention to what you're doing, then you need to figure out what he is paying attention to and figure out a way to make that part of what's going on. So I thought, well, I always listen to Mrs. Riggins. What do I have to lose? So I came back in January, and I did just that. I met Fernando out in the parking lot, made an appointment with him, and so we sat down and talked. It turned out that he was in a band on weekends, and he played the drums. And so we went straight from the appointment to the library, where I found a book on Gene Krupa. And he read it. And he never gave me another moment's trouble, and I didn't have to flunk him because he passed his own. So years passed. I started teaching out on the reservation. One day my husband was here in town having his hair cut. And he said, you'll never guess who I ran into today. It's one of your students from Pueblo. I said, not Fernando Camacho. And he said, how did you know that? He was at the barber college having a haircut. And the guy cutting his hair said, didn't your wife used to teach at Pueblo? And my husband said, yes. And he said, you know, she was the best teacher I ever had. And it was all because of Mrs. Riggins in Bisbee. He never met her, but she was what made me be a good teacher.
Did you have any favorite students?
Well, Fernando was the most disliked and ultimately the most liked. So
why is that?
Well, I guess because he was challenging, and yet we figured out a way to make it work together.
That's great. Is there something that will always remind you of Pueblo?
Well, let's see. I had a reading program. Kids could read books and put together points. And when they got enough reading points from reading library books, then there was a party at our house, and that was really fun. And I think I did manage to interest some people in reading who had never thought about being readers before. Readers, not readers for classes, but readers for fun. And reading for fun is something that sustains you for your whole life.
Is there a big book that like influenced you that you've read?
The book that influenced me the most was reading The Wizard of Oz in second grade, because my second grade teacher had those Wizard of Oz books over on the shelf by the window, and if you finished your work early, then you could read one of them. I think a lot of kids, when they read about the Wizard of Oz, they see the wizard standing behind a green curtain. What I saw was Frank Baum standing behind the words. And as soon as I read those books, I wanted to be Frank Baum when I grew up. So from second grade on, I wanted to be a writer. I became a teacher because in 1964, when I tried to get into the creative writing program at the University of Arizona, the professor wouldn't let me in. He said, "You're a girl." I said, "So?" He said, "Girls become teachers or nurses, boys become writers." And he wouldn't let me into his class, which is why in my favorite book, Hour of the Hunter, the crazed killer is a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona.
Well, recently there was a story, or recently KGR9 did a really negative story about Pueblo students. And what would you like to say to people who have a negative impression of Pueblo?
Well, I think they ought to come here. I think a lot of times people are very critical of things they don't know or understand. I was from Bisbee, and I was astonished when I came to Pueblo and listened to that boys' chorus sing La Bamba. That was wonderful to me, and it was part of the Pueblo culture that I was able to learn from and take away with me.
Is there anything you want people to know about Pueblo?
Come here and visit and make a contribution instead of criticizing.
What is it like being a famous author? Why did you choose this path?
Well, it's the path I always wanted to be on. What's it like? Well, on the one hand, it's hard work. Right now I'm trying to start a book, and the book is not starting. And I know that I have a deadline, and I have to put 100,000 words in that book between now and the 1st of February. But I also know that when I go out and do book signings, I meet people who tell me they've read my books in hospitals while they were waiting in a waiting room because someone they loved was very sick. Or they read my books while they were a patient in a hospital. And that's really high praise, to know that my books have helped people get through a tough time. Because the ancient sacred charge of the storyteller is to beguile the time. In time when you're sick, or worried, or scared, that's time you need a beguile.
Is that what encourages you to write more books? Is knowing that you can affect someone's life and help them through a hard time?
It does keep me on task, yes. It keeps. But the other thing is, I don't see myself as a famous author so much. And my kids and my grandkids, they would think that was hilarious. But I see myself as a storyteller. And storytelling is what I do. I don't see myself as a novelist, and I don't see myself as a famous person. I see myself as a storyteller.
Do you still like to read often?
What did you catch me doing when I was out there in the car? I was reading somebody else's book while I was waiting. Of course, I like to read. I've always loved to read.
Who inspires you today?
Who inspires me today? Boy, that's a difficult question. I read a lot of other people's books. But, you know, I think the people who inspire me most are the wonderful young people in this country who put on our nation's uniforms and go and protect this country from people who would tear it down. I encounter them in airports, I encounter them in restaurants, and I always try to say thank you.
That's good. What major historical periods, events, or crises were you going on? What was going on when you taught at Pueblo?
Well, it was during the Vietnam War, where it was toward the end of the Vietnam War. And so that was a big issue. And it was a divisive issue. You were either on one side of that war or you were on the other side. There wasn't very much middle ground.
Do you regret coming to Pueblo, even though you didn't teach long, but would you take it back for anything?
Not at all. That's the thing about life, is it's a learning process, and I think you learn things from everything you do. What I put in my books are bits and pieces that are the culmination of my whole life. And if I left one out, then my life would be terribly different. My first husband died of chronic alcoholism at age 42, a year and a half after I divorced him. You don't die of booze in your early 40s without working really hard to make it happen. And so, from the standpoint of living happily ever after, being married to him was a really dumb idea. But in terms of material, the guy was a gold mine.
Is there a little Pueblo in any of one of your books specifically?
Not that I know of, but the thing that is interesting to me is things leak into my books without my necessarily knowing it. I was at a book signing for my fourth book, and a lady came up to the table and she said, at that point the only books I had out were 4 Detective Beaumont books set in Seattle. And she said, you know, Beau drinks every day. He has a drink of choice, and it started to interfere with his work. Does J.P. Beaumont have a problem? And I said, you know, these are books. But it turned out 7 other people asked me that time about Beau's drinking, and I finally realized that I had put what I had learned from my husband's drinking into the background of those books without really being conscious of it. So there could very well be a little Pueblo high school lurking in my books, and if you find it, let me know.
Okay. Is there, do you enjoy book signings?
Yes, I do. It's an important part of the job. I think some people believe that writers get to live like little hermits, and you know, all you have to do is write the book and then you send it to the publisher, and then your job is over. But that's not true, because you need to be able to go out and talk to people about the book. You need to be the advocate for the book. And so when people tell me they want to be writers, but they don't want to have to speak in public, I tell them, get over it, because you will have to speak in public. And the best way to do that is to go to Dale Carnegie and take a course in public speaking.
What is your most memorable book signing experience?
When we were living on the reservation, after I left here, on the 22nd of May of 1970, A woman was murdered on the reservation. She was forced off the highway 10 miles west of Sells. She was shot, raped in front of her 2 small children, and left to die. 20 minutes later, her killer picked up my husband and gave him a ride to our house out by 3 Points. And when they went up to the house, he said, well, do you leave your wife out here by herself much? And my husband said, well, you know, she's got the dogs. Well, he had no idea that he was speaking to someone who had just murdered a human being. We found out about what had happened that evening. We went into, when we were coming into town for dinner, we got stopped at a roadblock and found out about the homicide on the reservation. We lived 7 miles from town, 7 miles from the nearest neighbor and or telephone, and 2 miles off the highway. So we told the deputy at 3 Points what had happened to my husband the day before. And at 6 o'clock the next morning, he was there. He interviewed my husband for 8 hours. He got him to remember all kinds of important details of things that had been in the car, things the guy had said. He had my husband identify the car, the make and model of the car. The day after that, he had him do a composite drawing. And as soon as the little 4-year-old boy saw that picture, he said, that's the man who killed my mommy. In the course of the next several weeks, we found out that she was his 3rd victim, that he killed people at 20 minutes after 2 on the 22nd day of the month. That was on the 22nd of May. They picked him up on the 20th of July, and he admitted to having been to our house on 3 separate occasions in the intervening 60 days, and we had been scheduled to be July 27th. So then he did a plea agreement. He went to prison, and I sort of forgot about that. But for 40 of those 60 days, while my husband was working out of town, I was on the hill by myself. And I wore a loaded weapon. I was prepared to use it, and I actually fired 9 shots from that 22 at a rapidly retreating rattlesnake, and he was still laughing when he went up over the wall and disappeared. But the killer killed people at 20 minutes after 2 on the 22nd day of the month. He shot them off moving vehicles. He shot a 40-something-year-old man off a bulldozer. He shot a 16-year-old girl off a bicycle. And he shot the woman on the reservation. The first book I wrote, a book that was never published by anyone, was a true crime treatment of that book, and it was 1,200 pages long. Nobody would read a book that long. But eventually, I took the material I learned then and turned it into Hour of the Hunter, my first hardback. Years later, I was at a book signing in Pine Top. And it was in a library, and after the signing was over, people come up and they get their book signed and they want to visit and so forth. But if you do enough book signings, you can see if there's going to be somebody who's a problem. And they're usually people who don't want to have book signs, and they kind of hang around at the back of the room and they wait until you're alone, and then they come up and they pounce. So I saw this woman standing back there, and I thought, oops, I bet she is the problem. Eventually, everybody left the table. My husband was busy with friends, so I was sitting there all by myself. She came up and she said, was your husband a witness in a series of homicides that took place in Tucson in 1970? And I said, yes, he was. And she went on talking as though we had been involved in this conversation for years. She said, my father was the man on the bulldozer. My mother was pregnant with me when he died. She would never tell me about it. What can you tell most memorable. That does it.
Yeah, pretty much. Is there anything that you want to say before we go?
I just am really honored to have been invited, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. We really appreciated you coming out and doing this interview and being an honorary member.
And if you track down Fernando Camacho, tell him hello for me.
I will, promise. So this is Jance, and okay.
Over and out.
Thank you.
You're welcome.